This is Newport, County Mayo. It has existed here since the early years of the 18th century. It has experienced the vagaries of war and peace. It has experienced booming trade and deep recession. Currently it's undergone something of a renaissance thanks to the Great Western Greenway, a walking and cycling track that was once a rail line to Achill. But this is not where our story begins. It starts a few miles further on, at St Mary's Friary in Burrishoole, the old port. So, here it is, the old port of Burrishoole. Little remains here today except the Dominican Abbey and the parish church behind it. But in 1235, the Butlers arrived here with the invasion of Connacht. Now, the Butler family established themselves right on this hill, right beside me here. They built their first Butler castle. And around that castle developed a small town, the town of Burrishoole. Burrishoole comes from two words, the Norman word burgage, meaning a town, and Oul could possibly mean a borderland. That borderland being the border between the mountains to the north and Clew Bay to the south. The Butlers remained here under fairly constant attack from the native Irish, particularly the O'Connors, once the High Kings of Ireland, who came here to Burrishoole and burned the Butler castle on a number of occasions. In 1233, one of the Butlers is shown as owning vast amounts of land here in the cantrad of Owl Butler in the lordship of Connacht. However, by the late 1300s, the power of the Butlers decreases in this area. Perhaps they left here and concentrated their efforts on Kilkenny, where their main seat was. The Butler dominance of Burrishoole lasted less than 100 years. The next family to take control would be far more powerful and resilient. Like the Butlers, they too were of Norman extraction, and they would rule the region during its most turbulent period in history. Their name was Deburgos. Deburgos, Deburg, Burke. This famous family came here in 1235 with the Norman invasion of Connacht, with people like Adam de Stanton and Jordan d'Exeter. The Deburgos remained and cut out vast swathes of land for themselves in West Mayo. For almost 300 years, the Deburgos showed great powers of survival here in Mayo, retaining to themselves the title the MacWilliam Eachtar, Lords of Burrishoole and lands further north. The most famous of these Burkes was Richard O'Nearan, so called because he owned an iron mine and a smelting furnace, which gave its name to the village of Furness. The town of Burrishoole flourished under the Burkes, though its industry and commerce was largely unknown until the arrival of Malby in 1580. While he was here, Malby observed what he saw, and what he saw he recorded for posterity. He wrote to his masters in London, explaining that as many as 50 ships a year would arrive here to trade. They traded for fish, for timber, for marble, and for iron. So we can imagine the cries of sailors, the loading of cargo, the languages of Europe, Spanish, Italian, English, mixed with the native Irish as business was transacted. We can even hear the Friary bell. We can see the little boats toing and froing from the shore as monks returned from some pilgrimage to some far-off land. In the following years, the Deburgo influence in Burrishoole was further strengthened by their alliance with other clans, in particular the OMalleys. In 1566, Grace O'Malley, known as Gráinne ní Mháille, daughter of Owen, chieftain of the OMalley clan, married Richard O'Nearan de Burgo. For Grace, this was a strategic marriage, for she had now become chieftain of the OMalley clan. They married under Brehon law, and when a year was up, they divorced. Grace retained Rockfleet Castle beside us here, a few miles further west of St. Mary's Dominican Friary. While Grace and Richard continued to live apart, it is suggested that they had a most powerful alliance. That alliance saw Grace bring her husband Richard to Galway in 1576 to submit to Sir Henry Sidney, the Lord Deputy of Ireland. And it is most interesting to read what Sir Henry recorded of that meeting with Grace. There came to me a most famous feminine sea captain called Gráinne O'Malley, and offered her service unto me wheresoever I would command her, with 3 galleys and 200 fighting men, either in Ireland or Scotland. She brought with her her husband, for she was by sea and by land more than Mrs. Mate to him. This was a notorious woman in all the coast of Ireland. Grace's reputation far preceded her. Such was her standing that in 1593 she went to London, where at Greenwich she met Queen Elizabeth I. She died in 1603. Thus ended the life of a most influential woman. She was one of the last chieftains of the old Gaelic way of life, at a watershed moment in Irish history when the old traditions and the Brehon laws were about to pass into memory. By 1578, Richard O'Nearan was again in revolt. This continued to simmer till 1582, when he submitted for a second time, this time to Nicholas Malby, and he was finally recognised as the Mac William Éachtar, the long-accepted Burke title. Although Richard had achieved his life's ambition, the Mac William title, yet wars and time had worn him down. He was an old and defeated man. He was a spent force. However, this was not the worst thing to happen to Richard. He lost his estates, and 4 years later he's dead. So too is Nicholas Malby. The annals of the Four Masters describe Richard as a most warlike, unquiet, a plundering man. On the other hand, they describe Nicholas Malby as a man learned in the languages of the islands of the West, a man victorious in battles. By the end of the 17th century, the Butlers of Ormond, remember them? Well, they reasserted their right of ownership to over 70,000 acres of land, to 4 castles, and to the manor and town of Burrishoole. And with a restored monarchy in England, they had that right confirmed. And what of the Burkes? Well, history teaches us that fame and power and wealth can be transitory, and so it was for this family. By 1594, at the end of the 16th century, a century of trials and tribulations for this family, they were much reduced in circumstances. Indeed, Tibin Burke was merely a tenant of the Dukes of Ormond. And by the Strafford Inquisition of 1635, Miles de Burgo, or Miles Burke, was owner, possessor of a few townlands, such as Keelogues and Arda. Sic transit gloria mundi, thus passes the glory of the world. In a sense, we are standing in what archaeologists and historians call a sacred landscape. A landscape dotted with holy wells, ruined churches and place names that carry the memory of early Christian saints. When St. Patrick converted the Irish to Christianity, he intended that the church he founded would be based on a diocesan model. The Irish had other ideas, and the Christian church that emerged was based around individual monastic settlements, each monastery usually having a direct relationship to the local tua or clan group. Another feature of Christianity in those years was the emergence of an anchorite or hermit tradition. This convention appears to have arrived here from North Africa. In the western deserts of Egypt is the Coptic monastery of St. Mina, close to Abu Mina, the original place of pilgrimage. And here, on the west coast of Ireland, is Kilmina, near to Newport. This name and the few ruins that remain of the early church reinforce the conviction that there is a long and strong connection between the Desert Fathers and the early Irish church. In Burrishoole there are many examples of early Christian sites. Here in the townland of Kiltarnat, St. Sarna is commemorated. She was a holy woman or a hermit, and her cell or dwelling place was somewhere here in what was a ring fort or a rath. Frequently, early Christians would take ancient pagan dwelling places, wells, ring forts, and turn them into Christian sites of devotion and pilgrimage. St. Birog's well in the nearby townland of Achadui Glebe is linked with Birog, whose gift was the healing of eye ailments. St. Marcon's Loch is another site with an early Christian connection, this time linking St. Bridget and St. Marcon. He is associated with cures for animals and a feud with Bridget. Another early Christian saint who is long remembered is St. Brendan the Navigator. His holy well and church is here at Killeen. Chaumpel Cool Lagrain was the parish church for the community that developed around the old port of Burrishoole. When the Dominicans arrived in 1469, it was already most likely 200 years old. It continued to be used for some time after that. By the end of the 12th century, the golden age of Irish monasticism was over. New religious orders would reform the Celtic Church and bring it under the supervision of Rome. It was the custom and practice of lords and chieftains in the Middle Ages to endow a religious order with lands and a church, so that they, the Lord, would have some place to retire to at the end of their lives and prepare themselves for the afterlife. And Richard Deburgos of Thurlow did just that. He invited the Dominican order here to Burrishoole to establish this friary dedicated to Mary. The first buildings were erected in 1469 and final papal approval was given in 1486 by Pope Innocent VIII. All that remains today are the walls of the friary. However, other buildings can be inferred. For instance, we have a doorway here leading from the church into what was probably the sacristy, and beside the sacristy, the chapter house, and further along, the refectory. The Dominicans were a mendicant order founded by Dominic Guzman in the early 1200s to combat heresy in France and in Spain. They quickly spread to other European countries, including Ireland. They were supreme teachers and preachers, well versed in scripture and theology. They were already established here in what was to become County Mayo, at places like Rathfran in North Mayo and near Strayed at Foxford. Each friary was required to have a lector, a teacher. His job was to regulate the intellectual affairs of the friary. He would prepare novices for the priesthood, train others in preaching and in teaching. He was second only to the prior in importance. This is the nave of the church, the western end of the church, and it is here that the laity would attend Mass. In the centre of the church here is the tower. The tower divides the chancel or choir from the nave. It also contained a rood screen which gave a degree of privacy to the area known as the choir. And here in the choir, the monks would attend services. They would sing their divine office, they would chant, they would say their prayers, and they would attend Mass. Apart from the church, the chapter house was the most important room in a friary. Here, each day, a portion of the Rule of St. Dominic was read. The Rule of St. Dominic was based on that of St. Benedict of Nursia. The refectory, or main dining room in a friary, usually occupied a building in the North Range, and here at St. Mary's, this meant this area here. The consumption of food in a friary was a highly ritualised event. Before entering the refectory, each monk would wash his hands. On entering the room, he would venerate a crucifix, and then he would take his place at his seat. The seats were arranged around the walls of the refectory, and each monk would sit in order of importance. The prior at the head, beside him the lector. The space in the middle was left open for the serving of food, and also for any monks who had to carry out a public penance. We can't be quite sure of the number of friars here at Burrishoole. The rule was that there should be a prior and 12 friars. In the bigger friaries there would possibly be between 30 and 40 friars. However, given the size of the buildings here at St. Mary's, we can say that there were probably between 12 and 20 friars here. This is the cloister gart, or garden, and here each day the friars would come to perform their divine office, to walk in silent contemplation, to meditate. Dominican friars were noted for their learning in matters of scripture and theology and canon law. The friars loved to acquire books. Some of the books were donated by benefactors, and some they commissioned themselves. They may have had a library here at St. Mary's, but for them a library could be as few as 10 or 20 books. They may also have had a scriptorium here, possibly above the refectory, and in the scriptorium the monks would copy and write manuscripts. The friars continued to live and work here at St. Mary's in relative peace and calm. The Reformation had little effect until the time of the Elizabethan Wars, when the friars were forced to leave. It was at this time that Nicholas Malby garrisoned the abbey to force the surrender of Richard and Erin. Whatever we may say about Elizabethan wars and Malby's occupation of the friary, in 1653 much worse was to follow. Cromwell's soldiers would occupy the friary with devastating consequences. The violence inflicted by the Cromwellians across the entire country was repeated here at Burrishoole. The countryside was ravaged and pillaged. The people were displaced. The friars were forced to flee or remain and be slaughtered. At this time there was a small cloister of Dominican nuns across the harbour from the friary. The convent was probably near to where Abbeyville House stands today. They were members of the Dominican Third Order, who lived lives of quiet piety according to the Dominican rule. The nuns were Honoria Deburgos, daughter of Rishdar an Éireann and her friend Honoria McGann from Castlelaffy near Kilmena. When the Cromwellian soldiers occupied the area, the nuns were forced to flee. And it was to this island behind me, that the nuns fled to seek refuge. Their hiding place was soon discovered. They were captured and severely beaten. Later, Honoria Deburgos was brought to the Friary, where the elderly nun died. She was reputed to be 104 years old. Her friend Honoria McGann fled to a local wood, where she hid in a tree trunk. She was found dead of exposure the next day. Both nuns are buried in the Friary. A simple shrine here by the riverside, near the present Burrishoole Bridge, commemorates their lives. Most interesting is that in Sicily, in Taormina, in the former convent of San Domenici, now a hotel, there is a fresco depicting the martyrdom of Honoria McGann. It was recognised for what it was in 1921 by the Right Reverend Monsignor Curran, a Dublin priest. Many friars lived out their lives here at St Mary's. Some of the more notable ones were Father Taddeo Duane, who was a member of the friary when Nicholas Malby occupied it. It is said that he converted the garrison of troops after Malby left. Friar Felix O'Connor is reputed to have brought the story of the martyred sisters to Sicily after he escaped in 1653. Friar John O'Hart was lector here in the early years of the Cromwellian Wars. Friar John MacDonald is said to be the last prior of St Mary's, Burrishoole, in 1798. After that, the friars were dispersed about the community. John O'Donovan of the Ordnance Survey recorded in the 1830s that a friar named Dominic MacDonald died suddenly by the roadside between Burrishoole and Newport in 1795. The last friar to take the habit of St Mary's was Friar John Hughes of Galway, whose habiting was at Esker near Athenry in 1826. The friars remained in Burrishoole through war and peace, through Reformation and Counter-Reformation, until they were dispersed about the community. So, there was no definitive end to the friary. It simply faded to ruin over the centuries. However, it remains a place of calm, of peace, of tranquility, a resting place. When Captain Pratt leased the estate from the Medlicots, he travelled to Mayo and came out here to Burrishoole. He wanted to survey the old port and town with a view to setting up a linen industry. However, he was not impressed with what he found here. The ravages of war and time had taken their toll, and so he had to find a new location for his town. So he decided to develop his new town here on the Black Oak River, a town that would reflect his new port and bear his name, Newport Pratt. One implication of this is that the new town would be based not on the old manorial system, a system that had served Ireland and indeed Europe since the coming of the Normans, but a town which would be based on a market economy, an economy with money at its heart. This would be the guiding principle of Newport. Building commenced in the early years of the 18th century, and Pratt's first tenants were a community of Quaker weavers. The houses that you see behind me were theirs. They're quite simple. On the ground floor they have a door and a window, and upstairs one further window. The stone windows are interesting in that the lintels are segmented stones with a keystone. Much of the houses are now covered with plaster. The Society of Friends, or Quakers as they were more commonly known, were more than a religious organisation. They were, and are, an industrious people. They were especially known for their involvement in the linen industry, and thus their appearance in Newport, where their efforts were successful for a time. Pratt's enterprise failed. He lost his Quaker linen weavers, he used up his capital, and his town was just too far west at that time. So the Medlicots made a crucial decision. They appointed James Moore as their land agent, and he was the man responsible for the development of much of the town, such as the quay that we see here today. He also developed shipping connections with the continent and with England. 18th century maps of the roads of Ireland show that Newport was an important destination. Moore's tenure as land agent to the Medlicots was marked with success. He is buried in Knockavilly Glebe, above the town. The Quakers left us some notable local names, such as Weaver's Row, now Castlebar Street. Bleachyard is another connected with the linen industry. There was also a Sailor's Row, a Barrack Hill and a Market Street, a Malt House and Brewery House, and a Deal Yard. Of course, the Medlicots had pride of place with Medlicott Street. The Custom House and Tan Yard were other important locations about the town. All these names are testimony to the business nature of the town in those early days. Newport has a most interesting religious history. Essentially, it had a Quaker beginning in the early 1700s. However, by 1740, that community had departed. They had failed to secure a meeting house or a burial plot, and indeed their children had no prospects of marriage, with the nearest Quaker community being in Moate in County Westmeath. In the years that followed, as many as 5 different religions were practiced in the town. The Church of Ireland was, from the time of the Reformation, and certainly from that of Elizabeth I, the approved state. Yet, the majority of the Irish people professed Roman Catholicism. They were effective as the other dissenting voices. Here in the townland of Knockavilly, the first Church of Ireland stands in ruin. The many notable burials testify to its importance. The cross of the Odonnells is that of James Moore, the first Medlicott land agent. Today it is a sombre place, yet it is peaceful and tranquil here. But in its day, its walls echoed to the thundering sermons of the Reverend Dr. Pocock and those of Caesar Otway. And they shall cast up dust upon their heads, and shall be sprinkled with ashes. And they shall take up a mournful song for thee, and shall remain. The late 17th century saw the Irish Parliament passing a number of laws to restrict the religious, political and economic activities of Catholics and dissenters. These laws became known as the penal laws. As a result of the penal laws, Catholic priests were forced to go into hiding if they wished to remain in Ireland. For those that stayed, it was necessary to say Mass in remote valleys and on hillsides, as far away as possible from the prying eyes of those that would betray them to the military. Here in Burrishoole there were a number of Mass rocks located in isolated places such as OMalleys, where people gathered to attend Mass.
And the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all.
When the O'Donnell family acquired the Medlicott estate, economic and political power moved to a new location within the town, and so too did the Church of Ireland. This is St. Catherine's Church of Ireland here in the centre of Newport and adjacent to Newport House. It was built at the behest of the Odonnells in the 19th century. It continued in use into the 20th century. Today it is a private dwelling. The Methodist Church emerged as a revival movement within the Church of England, and in turn quickly spread across the Irish Sea. John Wesley, the renowned preacher and founder of Methodism, visited Ireland on 21 occasions between 1747 and 1789. He visited Newport on 6 occasions, and a Methodist church followed. It is now the parochial hall. Presbyterianism was a long-established religion in Ireland, having deep roots in Ulster, and it too is represented here in Newport. This is the Presbyterian church here on the Castlebar Road. One of the notable things about the Presbyterians was that in the 18th century, many of their ministers spoke Irish and preached in Irish. Another noteworthy group were the Darbyites, called the Plymouth Brethren, founded by John Darby, the Anglo-Irish evangelist, during the 1820s. So Richard O'Donnell became a member of this group, and they used the old Methodist meeting house for their services. In the early years of the 18th century, Catholics began to move into the town. They set up small businesses. They had a chapel here on Main Street, though little of its history is known. St. Joseph's, the next Roman Catholic church, was built on Barrack Hill in 1803, on land given by Sir Neil O'Donnell of Newport House. The 20th century building. This is St. Patrick's Catholic Church. It was complete in Roman era. It dominates the skyline miles around and Cathedral Church. Before we go inside, have a look at this beautiful doorway. It is modelled on the doorway of Clonfert Cathedral in Galway. St. Brendan the Navigator is buried there, and his name also resonates with Burrishoole because he visited this area as he began his great journey of discovery. However, the real treasure is inside, behind the high altar. And this is it. Tragically, Harry Clarke never saw the last judgment window in position here in the church. He died in 1931 as it was being fitted. This is a magnificent piece of work. In the centre is Christ the King. To his right are the saved. To his left are the damned. And on the third panel up, among the damned, is Harry Clarke. He placed himself there. His modesty would not permit him to do otherwise. Harry was 42 years of age when he created this masterpiece of iconography. The parish priest, Canon MacDonald, surrendered his life insurance policy of £800 to pay for it. It is best viewed in the early morning when the sun is shining from the east. This is a commanding piece of stained glass. For some it is a religious icon, for others a major work of art. But whatever your view, it radiates an awe and majesty in keeping with its subject. In 1782, the Danish naval frigate Bjornholm arrived damaged and distressed here in Newport Bay. Storms and serious illness had driven her captain Matthias de Bill to seek refuge here. Members of the pairs were ship to the mystery of a local John McLaughlin did what he could for the ship. As will, the royal family rewarded McLaughlin, and with the monies he received, he built this house here on Main Street. And what of the mysterious illness? Well, a careful examination of all the records suggests that the men died from lead poisoning. This was a time of experimental tinning of food, and the suggestion is that lead might have leached into the food from defectively leaded tins. Others suggest that they might have died from malaria, because malaria was here in these latitudes at that time. In 1776, the American Revolutionary War broke the link between the colonies and the United Kingdom. In France in 1789, the French Revolution brought the rights of the common man a step closer. In Ireland, the United Irishmen decided that rebellion would also be the way. The 18th century is often referred to as the Age of Enlightenment. But for Mayo insurgents at the hands of Lord Cornwallis, there was no enlightenment in the autumn of 1798. A year that had begun with Catholic and Dissenter in arms together in Antrim ended in shocking bloodshed at Ballinamuck on the Longford-Leitrim border, ending forever the innocence of Republican struggle.
The French are in the say, says the Shannon Van Vogt. The French are in the say, says...
On Wednesday, the 22nd of August, 1798, a French expeditionary force landed at Killala in North Mayo. The events of the next few months were to become known as the Year of the French. With the aid of local guides, the French marched through Lough and the Windy Gap and surprised the English forces at Castlebar. The English fled. This confrontation is referred to as the Races of Castlebar. Newport had its fair share of United Irishmen, and they were quick to join the French forces at Killala. A tree of liberty was planted in the town. At this time, Manus Sweeney was a young priest in Newport. He was born at Rossmore in his grandmother's house. His father was an Achill Islander. In his youth he was noted for his piety and his learning. He was destined for the priesthood. He studied at the Irish College in Paris, where undoubtedly he became familiar with the principles of the French Revolution: equality, fraternity and liberty. Unknown to himself, he was to play a major role in the French connection with Newport and in the aftermath of the rebellion. Shortly after the capture of Castlebar, a French scouting party came to Newport. Father Manus Sweeney met with Captain Boudet, the French commander, and eventually made his way to Killala with the French forces. After the French had secured Castlebar, they appointed a directory, with John Moore of Moore Hall as President of the Republic of Connacht. However, their success could not be guaranteed without further support from the United Irish. This French and at Ballinamuck met with General Cornwallis's vastly superior forces. Humbert surrendered. The French marched away to be repatriated. The Irish were left to the mercy of Cornwallis. The rebellion had failed, and Father Manus Sweeney decided to make his way back to Newport. On his return to Newport, he was taken prisoner. He escaped and was recaptured on Achill Island. He was hung on the 8th of June 1799 here. And over here we have a mural depicting the events. After his execution on June the 8th, 1799, Father Manus Sweeney was interred in this plot in St Mary's Friary. And on June the 9th, 1912, this cross was erected to commemorate his death, and included among the words in the inscription are, "And his name shall be in request from generation to generation." Newport played its part in that rebellion, but it was a town divided between loyalist and dissenter. The name Gibbons is associated with the planting of this tree of liberty, and a yeoman, a member of the militia, James Kelly, is reported to have danced around the tree. It was claimed that the tenants of Sir Neil O'Donnell, or a chief part of them, were remarkably active in the rebellion. In 1798, Newport was hardly 100 years old, and yet it was already a town divided. And it would remain so until the embers of the Civil War were to cool in the new Ireland that emerged in the 20th century. If you consider the Norman invasion, the subsequent conflicts and disruptions, if you consider the Elizabethan wars of conquest, the Cromwellian atrocities, then they all pale into insignificance compared to the Great Famine that began in 1845. In 1700, the population of Mayo was 50,000. By 1800, it was 150,000. And in the 1841 census, it was over 400,000. This dramatic rise in population, in conjunction with the famine, meant that Mayo was likely to suffer greatly. The explanations for the Great Irish Famine are many and varied, and those whys and wherefores will forever be in. Among them was the potato. It was a well-nourished food supply. It was equally suitable to the Irish climate. In many places, families became dependent upon the potato. A family of 6 could consume 140 kilos per week. The famine shattered Irish society. The Quaker Arsenic Nicholson noted the devastation here in Newport and wrote about it. A cabin was seen, closed one day, a little out of Newport town, when a man had the curiosity to open it, and in a dark corner he found a family of father, mother and 2 children, lying in close contact. The father was considerably decomposed. The mother, it appeared, had died last and probably fastened the door, which was always a custom when all hope was extinguished, to get into the darkest corner and die, where passers-by could not see them. Subdivision of land to farms as small as 5 acres early marriage, large families, all these were approved by landlords because it meant more rents for them. In the rural areas there was also a barter economy, and any hard cash earned was used to pay the rent, and there was little incentive to diversify crops. Many more horror stories have emerged locally from the time of the Great Hunger, and one such story from this village is told by a man called Michael Gorman. Now it seems there was a man who was ill with fever, and there was nobody else in the house with him except his wife. The neighbours had shunned the house for fear of the fevers. And when the man died, his wife dug a grave beside the bed. She rolled her husband into that grave, then she covered it up. Hundreds of thousands died of diseases and fevers brought on by the Great Hunger. Hundreds of thousands left these shores, emigrated, never to return again. The great Irish scattering had begun. Over a century of emigration was about to commence.
The chraig siad an tír agus an cultúr agus an teanga. Is don lá tá inniu ann, is deacair é an teanga a athbheochan.
In the aftermath of the famine came the evictions, as the landlords tried to change the course of Irish farming, replacing people with cattle and sheep. Yet they too were sowing the seeds of their own destruction. The results of that famine are still with us today. We see them in the ruined stone cottages that still dot the countryside. We see them in the potato beds that still show their ancient ribs on the soft green hillside. We see them in the workhouses, now abandoned, that once housed the poor and the destitute and segregated them in those far-off times. Ellicott sold the estate to Odonnells in the 70s. They were the last titled family to own large here in Mayo. Mackle Island eastwards around for some miles. The mountains to the north and east form the other estate boundaries. When the O'Donnell family acquired the Burrishoole estate from the Medlicotts, they set about building Newport House. The re-emergence of this once powerful Gaelic clan was due to a number of factors. Amongst them was their resilience and their timely conversion to Protestantism in the 1760s. For 30 years between 1813 and 1843, Ireland's oldest book, indeed the world's second oldest Latin Psalter, was located here at Newport House. Legend has it that it got its name, the Cathach, from being carried into battle by the O'Donnell clan. This book of Psalms dates to the 6th century. Its survival is shrouded in myth and mystery. Some historians contend that it is the actual book copied by St. Columcille, thus giving rise to the Brehon judgment: to every cow its calf, to every book its copy. In 1813, the O'Donnells of Newport House received the Cathach from the Benedictine monks of Ypres in Belgium, where it was in safekeeping, awaiting the rightful claimant. Thus did Ireland's oldest book, a copy of the Psalms in Latin, return home. And in 1843, Sir Richard O'Donnell donated it to the Royal Irish Academy, and there it remains to this day. For over 150 years, the O'Donnells continued to control the Burrishoole estate. However, the famine years of the mid-19th century, the high cost of dowries and the failure to provide a male heir in times of male ascendancy led to their demise once again.
Entered the railway age in 1834 with the opening of the Dublin-Dunleera line. Over the next 30 years, rail networks reached most major Irish towns and cities. By 1865, the Midland and Great Western Railway had connected Westport to Dublin. From 1889, plans were prepared to develop light railways. Arthur Balfour, the Chief Secretary for Ireland, promoted these rail lines to comparatively remote areas where normal commercial interests were not prepared to build them. Westport, Newport, Mulranny, Achill was one such proposal, and in 1890 plans were well in hand to complete the work.
This is the Newport Viaduct. The first train to pass here did so in February 1894. And the last one in December 1937. The bridge itself is built of local red sandstone and cost over £7,640 sterling to build. There were over 1,000 men employed on the building of this railway.
The railway continued in business from 1894 to 1937. It was hoped that the railway would assist the Achill fishing industry, getting fish to markets in Dublin and other intermediate towns quickly and efficiently. It was also hoped that the emerging tourism market would benefit, and the railway's own hotel at Mulranny was testament to that. For all that, the railway fell victim to the economics of road travel and transport, and in due course it closed. It soon became a memory, grown bushes and trees, its bridges and culverts and cars, its restoration as a walking and cycling trail in the 20th century. More Newport at the heart of a link between Achill and West.
Yet it is the prophetic words of a 17th century Erisman that are remembered most in connection to the railway. Brian Rua O'Caravan foretold that a carriage on iron wheels, belching smoke and fire, would on its first and last journeys carry the bodies of the dead. And it was here, to Kildavnet Cemetery on Achill Island, that the bodies of 32 young people were brought. They had drowned in the Clew Bay boating disaster, and they were carried here on the first train to pass through Newport. Dahad is a tríomh líon in Iig sin, rinne gon Thoras a ríis, an tam seo ba chort deithnúr bucalí a bhí a gceist. Fuair siad bás a duine botí in Alban, agus tugan na corp an seo go hachla go relig Kildavnet an train a rinne an Thoras Jaranach trí bhaile I Íocán. Yeishdé go raibh an nanimneacha díalse.
Irish cultural nationalism emerges in the last quarter of the 19th century, and the spirit of national identity it engenders promotes yet another attempt to break the link with England. The resulting uprising flames into existence at Easter time in 1916 in the midst of the Great War. In a way, the War of Independence was for Newport a preparation for the Civil War. In the town and its hinterland, there was a strong tradition of Fenianism, a streak of independence stretching back to the 1798 rebellion.
Oh, Father, why are you so sad on this bright Easter morn? when Irishmen are proud and grand.
The west of Ireland played little part in the 1916 Rising. However, by 1917 the West Mayo Brigade was established, it was ready for action, and Michael Kilroy of Newport was its officer commanding.
Like you, I joined the IRA.
The English forces were engaged here at Kilmina in May 1921. This was a grim and intensive affair. The IRA were outflanked by the Black and Tans and faced withering machine gun fire. They lost 5 men killed and several wounded, while the English only lost 1 man and several wounded. Nevertheless, the IRA men made good their escape to Upper Skerda, north of Newport.
Where are the lads who stood with me when his
Tan troops searched the men who melted the day. '21.
Oh God, agree, I long to see the rise of the old brigade.
The events at Kilmina and Skerda taught the West Mayo Brigade a valuable lesson. In future they would plan meticulously and choose their ambush sites even more carefully. This planning was to pay off when in June a force of Black and Tans surrendered to Kilroy and his men here at Carrowkennedy. The truce was to follow shortly. In turn, the truce led to a treaty, signed in London and giving 26 counties a degree of autonomy, a free state within the British Empire. The other 6 would remain part of the United Kingdom. These terms divided the IRA into pro- and anti-treaty factions. Michael Collins, one of the signatories, prophetically stated that in signing the treaty he had signed his death warrant. A majority of the West Mayo column opposed the treaty and proceeded to seize many Mayo towns for the Republican cause. Michael Kilroy was now a general and officer commanding. Joe Ring and 4 of the old IRA men joined the new Free State Army. Initially, the Free State troops took Westport and Newport, while the IRA held the area to the north of Newport, places like Fallines and Doonetrusk. On August the 27th, 1922, Free State troops attempted to capture an IRA outpost on Convent Hill. The attack failed and 4 Free State troops were seriously injured. The IRA now moved south from their strongholds north of the town and in September recaptured Newport. Newport was now isolated and bridges on all approach roads were demolished. The Free State began its push to recover Newport in November 1922. Michael Kilroy was wounded and captured just south of Newport. At the same time, superior forces of Free State troops advanced from Castlebar under General Lawler. The Republicans prepared to meet them from the hill overlooking the old mill. The fight was intensive and lasted for most of the day. This convent of St. Joseph's, belonging to the Sisters of Mercy, was right in the line of fire. And meanwhile, in the convent chapel, the nuns knelt and prayed that no one would be killed while bullets cracked off the walls outside. And to this day, right up there, the scars of the bullets remain in the walls and in the statues of the convent. Eventually, the IRA retreated by Convent Hill and Bleachard towards the old workhouse. By November 26, General Lawler and the Free State forces had recaptured Mulranny, Shamor and Newport. A few more engagements followed, but essentially the war was over for the Newport men. Captured and court-martialed, they were sentenced to death. Fortunately for them, the war ended in time for them to be reprieved. Few who visit Newport today are aware of the tragedies and the sacrifices that the War of Independence and the Civil War wrought upon the people of the town and its hinterland. All is quiet now, all is peaceful. Yet those who gave their lives on whatever side they chose to fight are not forgotten. In death they are all one. This statue is erected to the memory of Edward Lyons. This young man's life reflects the horrors of war, the wanton destruction of a life stolen by circumstance. Ned Lyons, as he was known locally, was the young commandant of the Newport Battalion of the IRA. In June 1920, he was arrested by the British and taken to Galway prison. There he was ruthlessly tortured. Then he simply disappears. After the Civil War and War of Independence was over, Michael Kilroy, his successor, set out to find Ned. He finally found him in Dundrum Mental Hospital for the criminally insane. His mind was totally unhinged. He lay there curled in a ball upon a bed. He did not recognise Michael. Before he left, Michael Kilroy noticed that all his fingernails had been removed. Mercifully, he died in 1924 at the age of 28 in Dundrum Mental Hospital. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmer of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds. Martin Carey first appears in the record here in Newport in 1856 in the Griffith valuation. He's shown as owning properties in the town and in the nearby townland of Drumlong. By the early 1900s, he had a thriving set of businesses. These ranged from a corn mill to a flax mill to a sawmill and shipping warehouses on the quay. And the building here behind me, a corn store, offered drying facilities and storage facilities. In 1903, he was master of all he surveyed, but he had no family, and so he made his general manager, Patrick Walsh, his heir. At Carey's prompting, Patrick had married Brigade, who was the household cook. Eventually, Patrick inherited everything. Sadly, his son died and he had no heir. Martin Carey's most enduring legacy is here in the very walls of St. Patrick's Church, for he donated £10,000 towards its construction. This great act of generosity by Martin Carey is remembered in this plaque erected near the front door. Many of the buildings we see in Newport today are the reminders of that once powerful enterprise. The store on Main Street finally closed in 1960. Our journey has taken us from the old port of Burrishoole to Newport. Our story has revolved around people. However, it is the sea that links these places. The sea that brought the Vikings, the sea that took our emigrants to America and places further still. This great bay we call Clew Bay dominates the west coast of Ireland and still plays a part in the lives of people who live here. But it is no longer marauding Vikings or 16th century smugglers, but pleasure craft and fishing folk who ply the waters of the old and new ports. Land and sea have brought newcomers, more often welcome than not. An obstinate, stubborn air of survival, a sense of pride and dignity pervades this corner of Mayo as it reaches into the future.